She just needed a ride. He never expected she'd save an entire town. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let us uncover what really happened. The dust from the unpaved shoulder of Highway 73 billowed around Maya's worn hiking boots as another 18-wheeler thundered past, its horn blaring a perfunctory warning that felt more like an insult. She winced, pulling the frayed collar of her faded denim jacket tighter, though it offered little protection against the chill of the high desert wind or the gnawing anxiety in her stomach. At 28, Maya possessed a quiet resilience forged in crucibles far removed from this desolate stretch of road. But right now, that resilience felt paper-thin. Her ancient pickup truck, a relic she'd babied for years, had finally surrendered its mechanical ghost 3 miles back, leaving her stranded with a near-empty water bottle, a backpack containing little more than a change of clothes and a collection of strangely specific tools wrapped in an oily rag, and the sinking feeling that her attempt to disappear into anonymity was failing spectacularly. She wasn't running from the law, not exactly. She was running from a life that had become too loud, too demanding, too full of expectations she could no longer meet. A life where her unique skills honed in secretive government workshops and tested in unforgiving digital landscapes, had become both a beacon and a cage. All she wanted now was a quiet corner of the world where no one knew her name or what she was capable of. The small, forgotten town of Redemption, Nevada, rumored to be off-grid and fiercely independent, had sounded like such a place. Now, it seemed as unreachable as the moon. She thumbed the smooth, cool surface of a small, intricately carved wooden bird in her pocket, a token from her grandfather, a man who had understood the value of silence and the strength found in solitude. He'd been a watchmaker, his days spent coaxing life into tiny, complex mechanisms, a skill not entirely dissimilar to her own, though hers operated in the realm of silicon and code rather than brass and springs. Never let them see how the gears turn, Mija, he used to say, until the precise moment the clock needs to strike. She wasn't sure what clock she was waiting for, or if it even existed anymore. Another truck approached, this one older, a flatbed carrying a load of what looked like salvaged metal. Maya hesitated, then, with a sigh that carried more weariness than hope, she stuck out her thumb. The truck rumbled past, then, to her surprise, its brake lights flared. It slowed, gears grinding, and pulled onto the shoulder 100 yards ahead. A man leaned out of the passenger window, his face weathered, his eyes squinting against the sun. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a kind but tired expression. This was David. "You all right there, miss?" he called out, his voice raspy but not unkind. Maya walked towards the truck, her backpack feeling heavier with each step. "My truck broke down a few miles back," she said, her voice low, unaccustomed to asking for help. "Heading towards Redemption, if you're going that way." David exchanged a look with the driver, an equally grizzled man who just shrugged. "Redemption, huh? Ain't much there but dust and bad luck these days," David said, opening the passenger door. "But yeah, we're passing through. Hop in. Name's David. This here is Earl." Maya murmured her thanks, her own name, a common one, thankfully, and climbed into the cab. It smelled of diesel, old coffee, and something vaguely metallic. As Earl wrestled the truck back onto the highway, David glanced at her. "You got folks in Redemption?" Maya shook her head. "Just looking for a quiet place." David grunted. "Quiet it is. Too quiet, some might say. Especially since the network went down again." Maya's ears pricked up, a flicker of professional curiosity she quickly suppressed. "Network?" David sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Yeah, the town's whole communication and power grid, run by some fancy new automated system installed by Omnicorp last year. Supposed to be state-of-the-art, make Redemption self-sufficient. More like state-of-the-disaster. Goes down more often than a rodeo clown. And when it does, Omnicorp charges a fortune for their specialists to come out from Vegas to flip a switch, usually after a week of darkness and silence." He shook his head. "They got us over a barrel. Those vultures." Maya looked out at the passing desert landscape, her expression carefully neutral. Omnicorp. She knew the name. She knew their systems. She knew their vulnerabilities. She also knew she wanted nothing to do with any of it. Her past was a locked box, and she intended to keep it that way. The irony of seeking an off-grid haven only to find it crippled by a system she could probably dismantle and rebuild in her sleep was not lost on her. But she pushed the thought away. She was done with that life. All she wanted now was peace and perhaps a working vehicle. But as David continued to talk, his voice laced with the frustration of a community held hostage by technology and corporate greed, a tiny, almost forgotten gear began to turn, deep within Maya's carefully constructed silence. The problem, as he described it, wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a stranglehold. And Maya, despite herself, found herself listening with an intensity that had nothing to do with idle curiosity. The road to redemption was as unforgiving as the landscape it carved through. Earl, a man of few words, navigated the potholes and cracked asphalt with practiced ease, while David continued his lament about Omnicorp and the town's woes. Maya listened, piecing together a picture of a community struggling to maintain its identity in the face of predatory modernization. The Omnicorp system, he explained, wasn't just for power and communication. It controlled the water purification plant, the emergency services dispatch, even the automated locks on the town's small co-op storage facility. When it failed, redemption didn't just go dark, it ground to a halt. Last time it went out, David said, his voice grim, old Mrs. Henderson couldn't get through to the clinic when her husband had his heart spell. Took Earl here, driving like a bat out of hell to fetch Doc Martin. But it was a close thing. Omnicorp said it was a minor software glitch, charged us $5,000 for the reset, and patted themselves on the back. Minor for them, maybe. Maya thought of the intricate, often overly complex and deliberately proprietary architecture of Omnicorp systems. Do they provide any local diagnostics or override protocols? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. David looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Override? Heck, they barely give us a user manual. It's all black-boxed. Their man, a smarmy felon named Kalen, flies in with his little silver briefcase, taps on his tablet for an hour, and then everything works again for a while. Says it's too complex for locals to understand. He snorted. More like too profitable for them, if we did. Maya nodded slowly, a familiar pattern emerging. Deliberate obfuscation, dependency creation. It was a classic Omnicorp tactic. She'd seen it deployed on a much larger, more critical scale in her previous life, where the stakes had been far higher than a small town's utilities. She remembered a particular incident involving a compromised dam control system in South America, a system Omnicorp had installed. Her team had been called in after months of local engineers being told the recurring glitches were beyond their comprehension. It had taken her less than 6 hours to identify the backdoor Kalen, or someone very much like him, had left, a backdoor that was siphoning operational data and occasionally triggering deliberate malfunctions to justify emergency maintenance contracts. The memory left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had exposed it, of course, but the fallout, the political maneuvering, the way her findings were spun and then buried to protect powerful interests had been one of the many straws that broke her resolve. As they neared redemption, the signs of its struggle became more apparent. Houses looked a little more weathered, fences sagged, and the few businesses they passed had a tired, beleaguered air. The town itself was nestled in a shallow valley, a cluster of buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the desert. It looked like a place that time and opportunity had largely forgotten. There she is, Earl grunted, pointing towards a flickering, jury-rigged traffic light at the town's single main intersection. Heart of downtown redemption. Assuming it's got a pulse today. David sighed. Looks like the network's holding for now. But you can feel it, can't you? Like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Maya could feel it. It was more than just the visual cues of neglect. There was an undercurrent of tension, of suppressed anger, that clung to the place like the ever-present dust. She also noticed, with a professional eye she couldn't entirely switch off, the haphazardly strung auxiliary cables running between some buildings, the ancient-looking backup generator chugging away behind the general store, the solar panels on a few roofs angled inefficiently towards the sun. These were the efforts of a community trying to cope, to find workarounds, but they were band-aids on a gaping wound. Her own problems, a broken truck, an uncertain future, suddenly seemed very small in comparison. She had come to redemption seeking escape, but it seemed she had stumbled into a place that was itself trapped. Redemption's Main Street was a study in faded glory and stubborn persistence. The Gold Nugget Saloon, its paint peeling, stood opposite Henderson's general store, its windows displaying a sparse collection of goods. A few locals glanced at Earl's flatbed as it rumbled to a stop in front of the store, their expressions wary, a common defense in a town that had learned to expect little good from outsiders. David hopped out. "Well, this is us for a bit, Maya. Gotta unload this scrap for Henderson. He pays fair when he can. You need a mechanic. Old Tom down by the defunct gas station's your best bet, though I reckon he's got more rust than wrenches these days." Maya thanked them, shouldering her backpack. "I appreciate the ride, David Earl. More than you know." "No trouble, miss," Earl mumbled, already unstrapping the load. David offered a sympathetic smile. "Good luck with your truck and, with redemption. It could be a tough nut to crack." As Maya turned to head towards the direction David had indicated for the mechanic, a sleek, black SUV with tinted windows pulled up sharply beside Henderson's store, its tires spitting gravel. The Omnicorp logo was emblazoned discreetly on its side. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Kalen, the man David had described. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit that looked utterly out of place in the dusty town, and carried a slim, silver briefcase. His smile was all polished teeth and no warmth. He ignored David and Earl, heading straight for Mr. Henderson, who had just emerged from the store, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mr. Henderson," Kalen said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Payment for last month's system optimization is now 3 weeks overdue. Omnicorp's patience is not infinite, as you know. Continued service disruption is a distinct possibility if accounts are not settled promptly." Henderson, a stooped man with kind eyes but a worried frown, wrung his hands. "Mr. Kalen, I told your office the town fund is, well, it's a bit short this month. The last outage hit us hard. We're doing our best." Kalen's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Doing your best, Mr. Henderson, unfortunately, doesn't keep our state-of-the-art infrastructure operational. Perhaps the town should reconsider its spending priorities. Less on frivolous things," he gestured vaguely at the town, "and more on ensuring essential services." Maya, who had paused by the corner of the store, watched the exchange. Kalen's arrogance was a familiar brand. He exuded the quiet confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. David stepped forward, his face flushed. "Now see here, Kalen, that's unfair. This town is barely scraping by, thanks to your company's unreliable system and exorbitant fees." Kalen turned his gaze on David, a flicker of irritation crossing his smooth features. "And you are?" "David Miller. I haul for this town, and I see what your service is doing to it." Kalen raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Mr. Miller, the transporter of salvage." He made the words sound like an insult. "Your opinions on complex technological infrastructure, while undoubtedly heartfelt, are, with all due respect, irrelevant. Omnicorp provides a premium service, and premium services require premium payment." He then noticed Maya, lingering a few feet away. His dismissive gaze swept over her simple clothes, her dusty boots. "And who is this? Another concerned citizen? Or perhaps an apprentice in the salvage arts?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Maya met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. Kalen turned back to Henderson. "The deadline is end of day Friday, Mr. Henderson. I trust you'll make the sensible decision." With another cold smile, he got back into his SUV and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in his wake. Henderson sighed heavily, looking older and more defeated than ever. "Vulture," David muttered, clenching his fists. Maya watched the SUV disappear. She had seen countless Kalins in her time, cogs in a machine designed to exploit and control. They were always confident, always dismissive, always underestimating the quiet resilience of those they targeted. And almost always, they made mistakes born of that same arrogance. She wondered what mistakes Kalin and Omnicorp had made in redemption. The mechanic, Tom, was indeed more rust than wrenches, as David had put it. His small workshop at the edge of town was cluttered with the ghosts of vehicles long since surrendered to the desert. He listened to Maya's description of her truck's demise with a weary sympathy, then shook his head. Sounds like a blown gasket. Maybe worse, miss. Parts for that model? Might as well be hunting for unicorn tears around here. Could take weeks if I can find them at all. And I ain't got a tow truck that'll reach that far out. Maya's heart sank. Weeks. She didn't have weeks. She barely had enough cash for a few days' worth of food. Redemption, it seemed, was determined to hold her captive in its dusty embrace. David, who had finished his delivery to Henderson, found her sitting on an overturned oil drum outside Tom's workshop, staring blankly at the distant mountains. "No luck, huh?" he asked gently. Maya shook her head. "Tom says it could be weeks. I don't have that kind of time or money." David leaned against the workshop wall, kicking a loose stone. "Yeah, this town has a way of doing that to folks. Sucks you in, then makes it hard to leave." He paused. "Look, old Mrs. Gable rents out a room above the general store. It ain't much, but it's clean and cheap. Maybe you could stay there a few nights, figure things out. I got to stick around myself for a day or two. Henderson's trying to scrape together payment for that scrap, and Kalen's threat has everyone spooked about the network." Maya considered it. She had few other options. "Thank you, David. That's very kind." Mrs. Gable's room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single window overlooking the main street. But it was, as David had promised, clean. As Maya unpacked her meager belongings, she felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle upon her. She had sought anonymity, but this enforced stillness, this dependency, was not the peace she had envisioned. Over the next 2 days, Maya explored redemption, if explored was the right word for wandering its few dusty streets. She saw firsthand the impact of the unreliable Omnicorp system. The single refrigerated unit at Henderson's store, crucial for storing the town's limited supply of perishable goods, would often flicker and die, a constant source of anxiety. The town's small library, which also served as a community center, had an ancient computer that rarely connected to the intermittent satellite internet, cutting off the town's main link to the outside world. She saw Kalen again, gliding through town in his black SUV, a silent, ominous presence. He met with the town council, a group of tired-looking individuals who seemed utterly cowed by him. The whispers on the street were that Omnicorp was threatening a permanent shutdown if their exorbitant maintenance contract wasn't renewed at an even higher rate. One afternoon, Maya was sitting on a bench outside the library, sketching idly in a small notebook, a habit from her grandfather, who believed drawing calmed the mind, when she overheard a conversation between two elderly women. Their voices were low, laced with worry. "Martha's insulin," one said, "it needs to stay cold. If that fridge at the store goes out for good." The other sighed, "And young Timmy's asthma machine needs power. His mother's beside herself." Maya looked down at her sketch, a detailed drawing of the complex gearing system of an old, broken water pump she'd seen behind the general store. An idea, unwelcome but persistent, began to form. Later that day, she saw young Timmy's mother, a pale, anxious woman named Sarah, struggling with a sputtering, gas-powered generator outside her small home. The noise was deafening, the fumes acrid. Maya watched for a moment, then, almost against her will, she walked over. "Excuse me," Maya said quietly. "Is that a GX 200 series generator?" Sarah looked up, startled. "Oh, I think so. It's old. Barely works. But it's all we have when the power goes out. Mind if I take a look?" Maya asked, already noticing the telltale signs of a clogged fuel line and a misfiring spark plug. Sarah, desperate, shrugged. "Be my guest. Can't make it any worse." Within 20 minutes, using a few tools from her own backpack and a bit of ingenuity, Maya had the generator purring like a kitten. The sputtering was gone, the fumes reduced. Sarah stared, dumbfounded. How did you do that? Tom worked on it for a week last year and couldn't get it this smooth. Maya just smiled faintly. Just tinkered a bit. Glad it's working better for you. She didn't mention that the GX200 series had been a standard field generator in some of the remote outposts she'd worked in, or that she could probably strip and rebuild one blindfolded. As she walked away, Sarah called after her, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Maya didn't look back, but the woman's gratitude, so genuine and heartfelt, resonated within her, stirring something she thought had long gone dormant. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but in a town teetering on the brink, even the smallest act of competence, of kindness, could feel like a lifeline. And Kalen, in his arrogance, had no idea that the quiet, unassuming woman he dismissed so readily was slowly, almost invisibly, beginning to assess the vulnerabilities of his carefully constructed kingdom. The storm hit Redemption on Thursday night, a day before Kalen's deadline. It wasn't in the forecast. The sky, clear and star-studded an hour before, turned a malevolent black, and the wind rose from a whisper to a furious howl in minutes. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the dusty streets into muddy torrents. Then, with a sickening thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire town, the power went out. Not just a flicker this time, but a complete, deadening blackout. Maya, in her small room above the general store, watched the chaos unfold. Emergency lights, those that worked, cast eerie, shifting shadows. Shouts and cries of alarm could be heard over the roar of the wind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this wasn't just the storm. This was Omnicorp's system failing catastrophically, or perhaps being deliberately failed. David found her by the store's front window, her face illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning. "This is bad, Maya," he said, his voice grim. "Real bad. The backup generator at the clinic just sputtered out. Doc Martin's trying to keep things going with flashlights. And Henderson's fridges are dead. All that meat, all that medicine." Maya nodded, her gaze distant. "The storm is providing them with perfect cover," she murmured, almost to herself. "Who? Omnicorp?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "This is their way of turning the screws, isn't it? Forcing the town to pay up, no matter what." Suddenly, a frantic cry cut through the storm's noise. "Help! Somebody help! The purification plant. The overflow valve is stuck. We're going to flood the lower town." It was young Billy, Henderson's teenage grandson, soaked to the bone, his face pale with terror. The town's small, aging water purification plant, now controlled by Omnicorp's notoriously glitchy automation, was situated on a slight rise above the older, poorer section of Redemption. If it flooded, if the untreated reservoir water mixed with the storm runoff and overwhelmed the system, it wouldn't just be property damage. It would contaminate the town's entire water supply for weeks, possibly months. Kalen, who had been smugly ensconced in the town's only motel, the one building with its own robust, independent generator, emerged, looking annoyed. "What is all this commotion?" he demanded, trying to shout over the wind. "My team will assess the situation in the morning, when conditions are safer." Billy stared at him, aghast. "In the morning? It'll be too late by then. People's homes will be flooded. The water will be poisoned." Kalen shrugged, a picture of indifference. "Unfortunate, but Omnicorp cannot be held responsible for acts of God or for pre-existing infrastructural deficiencies. Our system is designed to be robust, but it cannot perform miracles with substandard local hardware." It was a blatant lie, and everyone knew it. The overflow valve was part of the Omnicorp upgrade. Henderson, David, and a few other townsfolk rushed towards the purification plant, armed with flashlights and a desperate hope. Maya watched them go, then turned and headed back to her room. For a moment, David thought she was retreating, and a pang of disappointment hit him. But then she reemerged, her small canvas backpack slung over her shoulder, a coil of thin, incredibly strong-looking filament wire in one hand, and a compact, multi-headed driver tool in the other. Her expression was set, her eyes glinting with a fierce, focused light he hadn't seen before. "David," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's roar with surprising authority. "Take me to the plant, and tell me everything you know about its control interface, specifically the manual override system, if one even still exists." David stared at her, then at the determined set of her jaw. The quiet, stranded woman was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone who radiated an almost palpable aura of competence and command. He didn't question her. He just nodded. "Get in my truck. It's old, but it'll get us there." As they battled their way through the wind and rain towards the stricken plant, Maya felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, a sharpening of the senses she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't excitement. It was the cold, clear focus of a professional facing a critical system failure. She had tried to escape this life, to bury her skills. But redemption, in its desperation, was pulling her back in. And Omnicorp, in its arrogance, had just made a very powerful enemy. The scene at the water purification plant was one of escalating chaos. Rain sluiced down the corrugated metal sides of the main building. The roar of the overflowing reservoir, normally a gentle spill, was now a deafening torrent. Henderson and a handful of other men were struggling futilely with a massive, rust-seized manual crank wheel that was supposed to control the main outflow valve, their flashlights cutting erratic beams through the darkness. It hadn't budged an inch. Inside the small control room, a newer edition built by Omnicorp, Kalen stood with his arms crossed, his expensive suit now spattered with mud, looking down at a blank, unresponsive touchscreen display. "As I said," he announced with forced calm, though a ticket started near his eye, "the primary control system is offline due to the extreme weather event. There's nothing more I can do until the network stabilizes and my diagnostic tools can interface. There has to be a manual bypass." Henderson yelled, his voice hoarse. "There always was before you people came." Kalen sighed theatrically. "The legacy systems were archaic and inefficient, Mr. Henderson. Omnicorp's integrated solution is far superior when operational." Just then, Maya and David burst through the door, dripping wet. Kalen's eyes narrowed as he saw Maya. "You again? What are you doing here? This is a restricted area. Civilians are not permitted." Maya ignored him, her gaze sweeping the control panel, taking in the dead screen, the sealed access ports, the proprietary Omnicorp interface box. Her eyes, accustomed to deciphering complex systems in milliseconds, were already identifying potential points of entry, vulnerabilities. "Mr. Kalen," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority that made him pause. "What is the specific error code the system displayed before catastrophic failure?" Kalen blinked. "Error code? I don't recall. It was a general system fault. Was it a cascade failure originating in the primary sensor array, or a kernel panic in the central processing unit due to voltage irregularities?" Maya pressed, her terminology suddenly sharp, precise, and utterly out of place for the lost girl Kalen had dismissed. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. The technical details are complex." "Not that complex," Maya said, moving towards the main control unit. "This is likely a Series 7 Omnicore controller, isn't it? With a redundant Cyclops OS, probably running a modified Linux kernel for the I/O processing. The manual override for the outflow valve, if you haven't completely disabled it, should be accessible via a direct bus interface, bypassing the primary OS." She pulled the multi-headed driver from her backpack. Before Kalen could react, she had already located a nearly invisible seam on the side of the Omnicore control box. With a few deft twists, a small panel popped open, revealing not a simple switch, but a complex array of diagnostic ports and a small, unmarked keypad. Kalen lunged forward. "Stop! You can't touch that. That is proprietary Omnicorp property. You'll void the warranty. You'll make things worse." Maya didn't even look at him. "Things can't get much worse, Mr. Kalen. The lower town is about to be flooded with contaminated water." She then plugged a slender cable, which she produced from her pack and attached to a small, custom-built device no bigger than her palm, into one of the ports. A tiny LED on her device flickered to life. David and the other townsfolk watched, stunned into silence. This was not the quiet, unassuming woman they had given a ride to or offered a cheap room. This was someone else entirely. Someone who moved with the confidence and precision of a surgeon. "What are you doing?" Kalen hissed, his voice trembling now, a mixture of fear and fury. "That's a restricted interface. You don't have the authorization codes." "Authorization codes," Maya said, her fingers flying over the keypad on her small device, a faint green glow illuminating her face, "are for people who follow the rules, Mr. Kalen. I'm more interested in results." Her device beeped softly. There we are. Root access. Sloppy work, leaving the default engineering password active on the secondary bootloader. TSK tisk. She then began typing a rapid series of commands, her eyes scanning lines of code that scrolled across her device's tiny screen. The air in the control room was thick with tension, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the ominous roar of the overflowing water outside. Kalen looked like he was about to have a stroke. He had built his career, his power, on the mystique of Omnicorp's technology, on the idea that it was too complex, too advanced for ordinary people. And now, this nobody, this girl who looked like she'd wandered in off the highway, was dissecting it with the ease of a child taking apart a toy. His entire world was crumbling before his eyes. The green text on Maya's handheld device scrolled faster now, a blur of symbols and commands that were incomprehensible to everyone in the control room except her. Kalen paced like a caged animal, muttering about lawsuits, security breaches, and irreparable damage. But his threats felt hollow, impotent against Maya's focused intensity. She was in her element, the chaotic sounds of the storm and the rising panic fading into the background as she navigated the labyrinthine pathways of Omnicorp's deliberately convoluted operating system. The primary valve actuator is locked out by a software interlock, triggered by a false positive from a corrupted pressure sensor in Sector Gamma, Maya announced, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm outside. "Kalen, your robust system is so terrified of a minor sensor glitch that it's chosen to flood a town rather than risk opening a valve." "Brilliant design," Kalen sputtered. That's an oversimplification. The safety protocols are complex. They're idiotic," Maya retorted without looking up, "and poorly implemented. You've got redundant flow regulators, but they're all slave to the same faulty sensor logic. It's a single point of failure dressed up in a million lines of bad code." She tapped a final sequence of commands into her device. "Okay, I've isolated the corrupted sensor feed and created a virtual sensor input that mimics nominal pressure. Now, to bypass the primary interlock and force a manual state change on the actuator relay." Her fingers danced over the interface. Outside, the roar of the floodwater seemed to intensify. David looked anxiously from Maya to the straining walls of the control room. "Is it working, Maya?" he asked, his voice tight. "Almost," she said. Omnicorp put in a timed authentication handshake for direct relay control, probably to stop exactly this sort of unauthorized maintenance. She glanced at Kalen with a look that was pure ice. "Give me the Level 3 override sequence, Mr. Kalen. The one that isn't in any of your public documentation. The one your field techs use when they really screw things up." Kalen's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you?" Maya's voice was soft, but it carried a razor edge. "It's usually an alphanumeric sequence, 16 characters, often based on the lead developer's pet's name or a significant date, encoded in base 64, then XOR'd with the unit's MAC address. Or is Omnicorp more creative these days?" Kalen stared at her, his jaw working. The level of specific, arcane knowledge she possessed was terrifying. This wasn't just some clever hacker. This was someone who knew their systems from the inside out. "If I don't get that sequence in the next 30 seconds, Maya continued, her eyes still on her device, "I'll have to brute force the relay controller. It'll take longer, and there's a small chance it could fry the board, leaving this town with no water control at all. Your choice." The threat, delivered so calmly, was devastatingly effective. Kalen's composure finally shattered. All right, he croaked, fumbling for his own sleek tablet his hands shaking so badly he could barely type. He read out a string of characters, his voice barely a whisper. Maya typed them in. Her device beeped 3 times, a confirmation tone. "Thank you, Mr. Kalen," she said, a hint of dry amusement in her voice. Always nice when people cooperate. She hit a final command. A loud clunk echoed from outside, followed by a distinct change in the sound of the rushing water. The furious roar began to subside, replaced by a more controlled, though still powerful, gush. On a bank of auxiliary physical gauges in the corner, ones Kalen had clearly ignored, a needle on a dial labeled main outflow valve twitched, then began to steadily climb towards the open position. Henderson, who had been watching with wide, unblinking eyes, let out a shaky breath. It's working. The water level, it's dropping." One of the other townsmen, who had peered out the door, shouted, "She did it. The main valve is opening. The pressure is easing." A ragged cheer went up from the small group. David looked at Maya, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. "Maya, how in the world?" Maya leaned back against the control panel, a small, weary sigh escaping her lips. She finally looked tired, the intense focus in her eyes softening slightly. "Let's just say," she said, offering him a faint smile, "I've had some experience with problematic plumbing." Kalen simply stared at her, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been comprehensively, expertly, and publicly dismantled by a woman he had dismissed as utterly insignificant. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small control room in Redemption, Nevada, a different kind of power had just asserted itself, quiet, precise, and utterly undeniable. The immediate crisis was averted. With the main outflow valve open, the dangerously high water levels in the reservoir began to recede, and the threat of the lower town flooding diminished with each passing minute. The townsfolk who had gathered at the purification plant, soaked and shivering but now visibly relieved, looked at Maya with a mixture of gratitude and profound astonishment. Mr. Henderson approached her, his old face etched with emotion. "Miss Maya," he said, his voice thick, "I wouldn't know how to thank you. You saved our homes. You saved our water." Maya offered a tired smile. "I'm glad I could help, Mr. Henderson, but the system is still vulnerable. What I did was a temporary bypass. Omnicorp's core software is fundamentally flawed and, frankly, dangerously insecure." Her gaze flickered towards Kalen, who was now slumped against a wall, his expensive suit ruined, his face ashen. He looked like a broken man. "He knows it," Maya added quietly. The other townsfolk murmured in agreement, their earlier fear of Kalen replaced by a simmering anger. "We've been telling Omnicorp for months that things weren't right," one man exclaimed. "They just kept sending us bills." David put a hand on Maya's shoulder. "You did more in an hour, Maya, than that charlatan has done in a year. What happens now?" Before Maya could answer, Kalen finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. You have no idea what you've done. You've tampered with a multi-million-dollar proprietary system. Omnicorp they will sue you. They'll sue this whole town into oblivion." Maya turned to face him, her expression calm, almost pitying. "Mr. Kalen, Omnicorp installed a system with known critical vulnerabilities, failed to provide adequate manual overrides, and left this town dangerously exposed due to what appears to be either gross incompetence or deliberate negligence. They then attempted to extort further payment under threat of service denial during a crisis. I have a full diagnostic log of tonight's events, including your cooperation in providing the override sequence. I also have a log of the system's state before, during, and after my intervention. I think Omnicorp will find that their legal position is, shall we say, less than optimal." She held up her small, custom-built device. "This little gadget? It's not just an interface tool. It's also a very efficient data recorder. Every command, every system response, every fluctuation in power and data flow for the last hour is time-stamped and securely encrypted. I imagine certain regulatory bodies might be very interested in its contents." Kalen's eyes widened in fresh horror. He hadn't just been beaten, He'd been documented. The full weight of his and his company's recklessness was about to come crashing down. As the storm began to subside, replaced by a steady, less violent rain, news of Maya's actions spread through Redemption like a current of electricity. People emerged from their homes, drawn by the incredible tale of the quiet stranger who had single-handedly faced down Omnicorp and saved their town. They gathered outside the purification plant, their faces upturned in the dim light, a silent, grateful vigil. Inside, Maya, with David's help, began the process of stabilizing the plant's essential functions, using her device to manually control pumps and filters, ensuring a supply of clean water would be available once the reservoir levels were safe. She explained what she was doing in clear, simple terms, demystifying the technology that Omnicorp had deliberately kept opaque. For the first time, the people of Redemption began to understand how their town actually worked or how it should work. The repayment to David for his simple act of kindness in giving her a ride was unfolding in a way neither of them could ever have imagined. It wasn't just about saving the town from a flood. It was about empowering them, about breaking Omnicorp's stranglehold, about restoring a measure of control and dignity to a community that had been systematically exploited. And for Maya, something unexpected was happening too. The cold, professional focus she had summoned to deal with the crisis was beginning to thaw, replaced by a tentative, almost forgotten warmth. The gratitude in people's eyes, the sense of having made a real, tangible difference, it was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience for a very long time. The locked box of her past was slowly, creakily, beginning to open. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a town slowly coming to terms with the extraordinary events of the night. The purification plant was stable, functioning under Maya's temporary manual control. Kalen had been quietly escorted to the town's small, seldom-used holding cell by the local sheriff, a stern, elderly woman named Martha, who had listened to Henderson's and David's account of the night with grim satisfaction and then declared Kalen a flight risk and a public nuisance. David found Maya sitting on an overturned crate outside the plant, watching the sun rise over the distant mesas. She looked exhausted but serene. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee from a thermos Henderson had provided. "You know," he said, sitting down beside her, "when I picked you up on that highway, I just thought you were some kid down on her luck. Maybe a runaway. Never in a million years did I figure you for whatever it is you are." Maya took a sip of the coffee, its warmth seeping into her. "I was down on my luck, David, and in a way, I guess I was running from a life that didn't fit anymore." "What kind of life was that?" he asked gently. "If you don't mind me asking. That stuff you did in there, that wasn't just tinkering." Maya looked out at the sunrise. "I used to work for a specialized government agency. We dealt with critical infrastructure security, cyber-physical systems mostly, protecting things like dams, power grids, communication networks from threats, both foreign and domestic." Her voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. Omnicorp was a frequent acquaintance. We often had to clean up their messes or uncover their more questionable practices. "So, you're like a super spy engineer?" David asked, a note of awe in his voice. Maya chuckled, a soft, tired sound. "Something like that, I suppose. Though it was rarely as glamorous as it sounds. Mostly it was long hours, high stress, and the constant feeling that you were fighting a battle no one else even knew was happening. I got good at it. Too good, maybe. It consumed me. Then, something happened. A bad one. People got hurt because of a system I was supposed to have secured. Not my fault officially, but it felt like it. I couldn't do it anymore. So I walked away. Tried to find something quieter. And you ended up in Redemption, in the middle of another Omnicorp disaster," David said, shaking his head. "Somehow, I'm not surprised." He paused. "That repayment you mentioned for the ride? I think you've more than covered it, Maya. You've given this town a fighting chance. More than that, you've given them back their hope." Later that morning, a town meeting was called in the small community hall. It was packed. Mr. Henderson, his voice stronger than it had been in years, recounted the events at the purification plant, praising Maya's courage and extraordinary skill. When Maya was asked to speak, she was hesitant, but David gave her an encouraging nod. She stood before the assembled townsfolk, not as a hero, but as one of them. She explained, in clear, simple language, the vulnerabilities of the Omnicorp system and how they had been exploited. She didn't offer easy solutions, but she did offer a path forward. What I did last night was a temporary fix, she said. To truly free Redemption from Omnicorp's control, you need to understand and manage your own systems. It won't be easy. It will require learning new skills, working together. But it's possible. This town has resilience. I've seen it. She then outlined a plan, how they could document Omnicorp's failures for a formal complaint to regulatory bodies, how they could begin to retrofit the plant with more robust, open-source control systems, how they could train local people, like young Billy, who had shown a keen interest, to maintain them. She offered to stay for a few weeks, to help them get started, to share her knowledge. Not as an employee, not for payment, but as a friend. The response was overwhelming. Offers of food, lodging, assistance poured in. For the first time in a long time, the people of Redemption felt a sense of agency, of empowerment. The quiet stranger who had appeared on their doorstep had not only saved them from flood, but had also shown them a way to reclaim their future. The fate of Kaylin was decided swiftly. Faced with Maya's meticulously documented evidence and the united testimony of the townsfolk, Omnicorp, after a flurry of panic calls from their legal department, agreed to terminate his employment and enter into negotiations with Redemption for a complete system overhaul and significant compensation. The threat of regulatory investigation, spearheaded by information Maya discreetly provided to a former colleague in a federal agency, was a powerful motivator. Kaylin himself was released with a stern warning to never set foot in Nevada again, his career in tatters, his arrogance replaced by a hollow shell of a man. The black SUV was gone by noon. Redemption was, for the moment, free of its tormentor. The following weeks in Redemption were a period of quiet revolution. Under Maya's guidance, the town began the arduous process of untangling itself from Omnicorp's technological grip. She worked tirelessly, often side by side with David, young Billy Henderson, and a small, dedicated group of volunteers. She taught them how to read schematics, how to solder circuit boards, how to write basic diagnostic code. She helped them source old but reliable industrial control components, often scrounging parts from her own broken-down truck or from Tom, the mechanic's graveyard of abandoned machinery. Tom, revitalized by Maya's presence and her respect for his old-school knowledge, became an invaluable ally, his workshop buzzing with activity for the first time in years. Maya never sought the spotlight. She was a facilitator, a teacher, a quiet enabler. She encouraged the townsfolk to take ownership of their infrastructure, to understand it, to not be intimidated by it. She showed them that technology, at its best, should serve people, not enslave them. The complex Omnicorp system at the purification plant was gradually dismantled, its proprietary black boxes replaced with simpler, more transparent, and locally maintainable controls. Maya helped them set up a secure, independent communication network using a combination of long-range radio and resilient mesh networking principles, freeing them from their reliance on Omnicorp's fragile satellite link. David watched her transformation with a quiet sense of wonder. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a steady, purposeful glow. She still carried her silences, her past, but it no longer seemed to weigh her down. In Redemption, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not just what she could do, she seemed to be finding a measure of the peace she had been seeking. Her repayment for the ride had become a gift of empowerment to an entire community. The townsfolk, in turn, embraced her. Mrs. Gable insisted she stay in her room free of charge. Henderson's store kept her supplied with fresh produce. Sarah, young Timmy's mother, often brought her warm meals. They didn't pry into her past, content with the remarkable woman who had appeared in their midst and changed everything. One evening, as Maya and David sat on the porch of the general store, watching the newly stable lights of Redemption twinkle in the twilight, David finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "So what's next for you, Maya? You can't stay in Redemption forever, patching up our old town." Maya smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached her eyes. "I don't know, David. For the first time in a long time, I'm not running from something. Maybe I'm starting to run towards something. She looked out at the small town, no longer a picture of neglect, but of quiet, determined revival. They're learning fast, she said. Billy isn't natural with the control systems. Old Tom has rediscovered his passion for mechanics. They won't need me for much longer. But they'll want you, David said. This town, you're a part of it now, whether you plan to be or not. Maya's grandfather, the watchmaker, had also told her, sometimes, Mija, the most intricate mechanisms are found not in clocks, but in communities. And the most rewarding work is to help them find their own rhythm, their own time. Perhaps redemption was that mechanism. Perhaps her work here wasn't just about fixing systems, but about helping a community find its own strength, its own beat. The day came when Maya knew her part in redemption's initial revival was complete. The purification plant was running smoothly on its new, locally managed system. The communication network was stable. A small team of trained locals, with Billy at the forefront, was capable of handling routine maintenance and troubleshooting. Her broken-down truck, resurrected by Tom and Maya's combined efforts, now idled by the roadside, ready for a new journey. The entire town seemed to turn out to see her off. There were no grand speeches, just heartfelt handshakes, grateful smiles, and a few tearful hugs. Mr. Henderson pressed a small, crudely carved wooden bird into her hand, a replica of the one she always carried. "So you don't forget us," he said, his voice thick. Sarah gave her a basket filled with freshly baked bread and local preserves. Young Billy, trying to look grown-up, promised to send her updates on the system performance. David stood beside her truck, a duffel bag at his feet. "Mind if I ride along for a bit?" he asked, a hopeful look in his eyes. "My hauling business in these parts is, well, let's just say Omnicorp's departure has opened up some new opportunities elsewhere. And I figure, after all this, the least I can do is make sure you get where you're going safely this time." Maya looked at him, at the open road stretching before them, at the small town of Redemption receding in her rearview mirror, a town no longer defined by its vulnerability, but by its newfound resilience. She thought of her grandfather's words. The clock had struck, and in its striking, something new, something unexpected had begun. "Hop in, David," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let's see where the road takes us." As they drove away, the narrator's voice might gently conclude, "In a world that often rushes to judge, that often overlooks the quiet ones, Maya's story reminds us that true strength doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it arrives in worn denim and dusty boots, with a skill for mending what is broken, and a heart willing to offer help where it's needed most." David's small act of kindness, offering a ride to a stranded stranger, set in motion a series of events that not only saved the town, but perhaps, in some small way, helped Maya save a part of herself. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever witnessed an act of quiet competence change everything? Or perhaps you've been the one to offer a helping hand, never knowing the extraordinary journey it might begin. Share your stories in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the greatest repayments are not measured in dollars, but in the renewed hope and strength of a community or the quiet healing of a single, remarkable soul. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the unexpected heroes among us.